Welcome, everybody. My name is Cecilia Van Hollen, and I'm the director of the South Asia Center here at Syracuse University. And on behalf of the South Asia Center of the Moynihan Institute of Syracuse University and the South Asia program in the Ainode Center at Cornell, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you to our conference today on food, health, and agriculture in South Asia. Syracuse University and Cornell, as a consortium, represent a Department of Education National Resource Center for South Asia, and each year the consortium organizes a conference on a theme of vital importance to the region. The aim of our conference today was to bring together academic and applied practitioners working on topics related to health, food studies, and agriculture in South Asia, and to share insights across disciplines and stimulate new collaborative ideas for research and for practice. Each of these three topics in and of themselves calls for a great deal of attention, but we considered the intersections of these three to be a somewhat neglected area of research, and yet to be of critical growing concern for the region. We're very honored to have two outstanding plenary speakers with us today. Dr. Krishnendu Ray, who teaches in the Department of Nutrition and Food Studies in the School of Culture, Education, and Human Development at NYU, who has written extensively on the cultural and historical context of food, and Rama Nagarajan, journalist and assistant editor for the Times of India, whose reporting specializes on health and healthcare, and who is currently a fellow at the Global Health Reporting Nieman Pulitzer Center at Harvard. In between our two plenary speakers, we have organized three very exciting panels. The first panel, I hope you've all been able to pick up a program. The first panel is on food and health, contemporary experiences in and influences of South Asia. The second panel, which will be following our lunch break, is on food systems and agriculture in South Asia. And the third panel will be on health, medicine, and food in South Asia. There are many different institutions and individuals who have made this conference possible. In particular, I would like to thank our three organizers for this conference. Tim Dye is professor and associate dean in the Falk College of Sport and Human Dynamics here at Syracuse University, and he took time away from his research leave this semester to take the lead role in organizing this conference. Furthermore, he also returned to SU from his leave in the hardship post of the University of Hawaii to be with us here this week. So very special thanks to Tim. Also, Sudha Raj, who also teaches in the Falk College at Syracuse University, and Saurabh Mehta from the College of Human Ecology at Cornell. So these three colleagues, we are extremely grateful to them. They have volunteered their time to conceive of and shape this conference. So please join me in thanking these three. Maybe you could stand. Saurabh, thank you. There's also, of course, a tremendous amount of behind-the-scenes organizing and planning that goes on to put on a conference like this, and I would like to thank, in particular, Anand Dwivedi, our associate director of the South Asia Center, and Amara Bridger-Wilson, the outreach coordinator, who is coming later, but is in fact doing another outreach program for our South Asia Center simultaneously. So she, although we'd like her to be in two places at once, that's not possible. And Nicholas Turner, the events coordinator for the Moynihan Institute, Gaurav Tiwari, our graduate assistant working for the South Asia Center. And I'd also just like to once again thank Tula Gwenka, who organized the film viewing and our Skype interview session with the director of the film yesterday evening that kicked off this conference. Last but not least, I would like to express tremendous appreciation for all of the institutions which provided the necessary funding and co-sponsorship to pull this all off. The U.S. Department of Education, through its support of the South Asia Center at Syracuse and the South Asia program at Cornell, makes this annual conference possible. So I'd like to thank the Department of Education, also to thank the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs and the Maxwell School's Moynihan Institute of Global Affairs here at Syracuse University. And also a very special thanks to the David B. Falk College of Sport and Human Dynamics at Syracuse, as well as to the College of Arts and Sciences at Syracuse. So all of these institutions help support this endeavor. So thank you all very much for joining us today. It's going to be a very exciting discussion, and I'm going to now turn the floor over to Sudha Raj, who will introduce our first plenary speaker.
Thank you, Cecilia. Good morning, everyone. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Krishnendu Ray, the plenary speaker for this morning's session. Dr. Ray received his PhD in sociology from SUNY Binghamton in 2001. He also holds a master's degree in political science from Delhi University, India, and a master's degree in sociology from SUNY Binghamton. Prior to joining the NYU faculty in 2005, Dr. Ray was a faculty member and an associate dean for curriculum development at the Culinary Institute of America from 1996. He's a food studies scholar with interests in social, historical, and cultural contexts of food. He's the author of The Migrant's Table, Meals and Memories in Bengali American Households, published by Temple University in 2004, as well as several chapters such as Exotic Restaurants and Expatriate Home Cooking in David Inglis and Deborah Gimlin's The Globalization of Food, and articles such as Nation and Cuisine, The Evidence from American Newspapers, Food and Foodways, Domesticating Cuisine, Food and Aesthetics on American Television, Ethnic Succession and New American Restaurant Cuisine, The Restaurant Books, Ethnography of Where We Eat. He's currently working on his next book-length project, which is tentatively titled Taste, Toil, and Ethnicity. He also serves on the editorial board of the journal called Food, Culture, and Society. Dr. Ray.
Thank you, Dr. Raj. And thanks for, thank you, Dr. Van Hollen. Thank you, Dr. Dye, for getting me out of New York City, where we get really provincial. We do. And for this great opportunity. I appreciate, although I must confess that being scheduled for the end of March in Syracuse made it feel like a setup. Perhaps I had more faith in the orange than you. So now it feels like I'm walking into other people's morning rituals with loutish delight. Because we might get some attention now. So let's try to look at the brighter side of this, I'm sure for many of you, unspeakable heartbreak of not getting to the final stages of the March Madness. What I want to talk about today, I want to start with a chef, Chef Floyd Cardos. His food looks outward from the peninsular subcontinent, or subcondiment, as Salman Rushdie would have it, rather than towards the heartland. It's the cooking from the world of Abraham Ben Yuji, the 12th century Tunisian Jewish merchant from Cairo, and Boma, his Indian servant and business agent in the Malabar, commemorated in Amitav Ghosh's In an Antique Land. It is It is the palatal memory of networks traversing the Arabian Sea that predate European colonialism. Excuse me. Rightly, Cardos asserts, what's known in the West as fusion food, different cultures together on a plate, started for me in the cradle, because fusion was, quite simply, a way of life for a family, end quote. While making a chicken curry for his father at the age of 20, he, I quote, recklessly added rosemary from the farmer's market to a part of a bottle of Riesling. The fragrance and heat of rosemary connected with that of ginger in the sauce and turned it into something marvelous. The wine smoothed and rounded out the flavors in a way he hadn't imagined. And my father declared it the best thing he had ever eaten, he says. From that bastard but delectable chicken curry, a segue was inevitable to hotel school in Bombay and Switzerland, finally to an entry-level job in Grey Kunz's legendary kitchen at L'Espinasse in New York City. So there's there in a slice of black sea bass on a Thai-inspired kaffir lime leaf emulsion, Cardos's long-suppressed repertoire of the mixed cuisine of the Arabian Sea acquired a second life. His first dish at L'Espinasse was the Hyderabadi lamb chop with squash, lentils, carrots, and cracked wheat. I hope at least this makes you hungry, if nothing else at the end of it. But the cardamom was too strong, and the chilies too hot. He had to cool it down. So he came to a very post-colonial conclusion, mixing biomedicine and Ayurveda for a Catholic man from Goa. I wasn't back in India, he writes, where chilies are needed to aid digestion and circulation, cooling the body down by perspiration, end quote. From there, he quickly moved to green mango marinated fluke with pickled daikon and beetroot, with the feisty vim of ginger and the verve of fenugreek. Tuna tartare with apples, with a pinch of chaat masala and mustard oil. Excuse me. Roast lamb with mint black pepper sauce. Goan spice crab cakes with avocado salad. So this is where the cuisine of the Arabian Sea pierces the Mediterranean. So in mixing Mediterranean products such as wine, although the Riesling itself pulls the Mediterranean fruit into a temperate zone. And rosemary in his chicken curry, Cardos was retracing what had already been commented upon by a Tamil poet almost 1,800 years ago. And these are some of the lines. May you live with a sweet life, giving away precious ornaments to all those who come to you in need, and never running out of them, while every day you take pleasure, as women wearing their shining bangles bring you the cool and fragrant wine, carried here in their excellent ships by Greeks, and the women pour it for you out of pitchers made of gold that had been fashioned with high artistry, O Maran. Okay, so you see this. It's an ancient reference in some ways. So Southern Indian court society was the destination, in fact, of Greek and Roman ships packed with amphora filled with Mediterranean wine and holds full of gold coins. Pliny the Elder, in fact, observed that India was absorbing 55 million gold coins from Rome every year. And we, of course, with the Greek reference, most of you would know this picture and this reference to the sailing guide to the Indian Ocean. We, in fact, know in exquisite detail, the itinerary of cargo headed from Alexandria, the great Egyptian port on the Mediterranean, up the Nile to Coptos, and from there on camelbacks to Berenice to be loaded on ships into the Gulf of Aden. The anonymous Greek work, Sailing Guide to the Indian Ocean, composed in the 1st century of the Common Era, appears to be a businessman's handbook to the Indian Ocean trade. The Periplus describes 3 main routes a ship might take from Aden, along the eastern coast of Africa, along the Arabian coast, or straight across the ocean, employing the monsoon winds. To ports such as Barugaza or Barukacha on the Gulf of Cambay in present-day Gujarat, to Kaligiris or Khanagiri along the Maharashtra coast near present-day Mumbai, or in the south at Musiris or Musiri in modern-day Kerala. You can see, of course, those kind of archipelago of cities on the Indian peninsula. So in modern-day Kerala, near the city of Kochi, laden with gold, aromatics, ointments, wine, and slaves, the ships would return weighed down by pepper, pearls, diamonds, tortoise shells, ivory, tigers, leopards, and cotton that Herodotus wrote about as a wild tree, I quote, which produce a kind of wool which is more attractive and of better quality than sheep's wool. And this, of course, is kind of an analytical map. The point of here is that kind of representing a more analytical point of view. Kind of most important point I want to convey out of this map is to kind of visualize the obvious, which is, of course, undermine the kind of a persistent rumor that India was isolated and in some ways, and that India can be understood only by the analogy to heartland and the Indo-Gangetic Valley. In fact, in today's talk, I'm going to repeatedly draw attention to, in fact, a peninsular India and other ways of imagining India, maybe more as skin rather than heart. So you can see the underlining the wide archipelago of cities connected from Rome and, of course, Syracuse at the top of it, through Petra, Aden, to Ujjain, Mathura, Madurai, Anuradhapura to Tamralipti in interlocking networks of trade. Second thing to point to is, of course, the zones of interaction with fragmented trading cultural areas in what would become India. And three, Southeast Asian pathways, of course, to China, where you see the connection there. You see these kind of series of networks. And we, of course, have more evidence too, and the best kind of evidence, which is more poem. In Musiri, with its drums where the ocean roars, where the paddy traded for fish are stacked high on the boats, and the sacks of pepper rise up beside them, the golden wares brought by the ships. And you see echo of the last poem too. Kuttavan, its king, to whom toddy is no more valuable than water, who wears the shining garland, gives out gifts of goods from the mountains, pepper, along with goods from the sea to those who have come to him. I mean, in some ways, I would argue that goods from the mountains, pepper, one could, if I had all day today, I could make an argument that, in fact, all of Western cuisine is really Keralite in its taste because of pepper. If wine makes something French or Mediterranean, pepper should in fact make something Keralite. And in fact, the whole world's cuisine in that sense can be imagined as in fact a Keralite palate. So deepening this point, my work on Indian diaspora in fact has led me inexorably to earlier dispersals to transcultural trade that I gave you a couple of hints at. So I'm learning to attend to Partha Chatterjee's warning, not to let the last 200 years of Indian history overwhelm the rest of it. And I find that counsel easy to keep in matters of food and taste. And of course, much of contemporary Indian tastes, such as the ubiquitous one for tea with cream and sugar, or for Scotch whiskey, would not be established without the last few hundred years. But that sits on top of much longer currents, especially where domestic cookery of peninsular India is concerned. The radical insight that a civilization could be named in the spaces between territories is, of course, Fernand Braudel's, who was my teacher's teacher. Arab geographers were aware long before about the relationship between different oceans and the Bilad al-Islam. But that conception of the connection between the sea and the people who lived around it was eroded until Braudel's work in reconstructing, through painstaking research, in over a dozen scattered archives around the Mediterranean, which allowed him to grasp the meaning of transnational sedimentation in the slow glacial movement of everyday life. The relative smallness of the Mediterranean and its closed nature turned out to be an advantage compared to the much bigger oceans. That, of course, was in 1949 in the Mediterranean and the Mediterranean world in the age of Philip II. That provoked, of course, K.N. Chaudhary to ask, half a century later, I quote, "The historian of the Indian Ocean must ask himself whether the period from the rise of Islam to the mid-18th century has the same coherence in the reign of Philip as the reign of Philip II, chosen by Brodel," end quote. Subsequently, that question has produced, of course, as you know, a whole school of historians from Sanjay Subramaniam, Sugata Bose, Thomas Metcalfe, to numerous others. If you're still having a difficult time catching what I'm implying here, and I'm going to kind of maybe belabor the point a little, just think of the moment on December 26th, 2004, when a giant tsunami rippled out from under the sea after a magnitude 9 earthquake, which lifted the seafloor by meters in some places and wreaked havoc around the rim, killing more than 200,000 people. The unity of the Indian Ocean was demonstrated with devastating effect, underlining also the limits, of course, of human agency. Sometimes the ocean rules, and men are insignificant. Sometimes men and women weave their nets, threaded with trade and conflict across far-flung port cities and their hinterlands. Of course, K.T. Achaya, that guru of Indian food scholarship, notes that there was a connection with Africa through Gujarat when the seas were at a considerable lower level, and a land bridge existed over which food plants of the hibiscus species, such as okra and ambadi, some gourds, and perhaps even the tamarind, can be traced back. Layered on top of it are more recent connections, as revealed in this Mombasa fish curry, where tamarind meets garam masala, and with boiled cassava and chapati. And here, of course, you see a beautiful layering of flavors. You can say the base of it is salt and pepper. And of course, salt and pepper in some ways evoke two worlds. Salt is in some ways, trade is clearly pre-modern, and pepper in some ways brings in the early modern. And in fact, of course, the Western table with its salt and pepper shaker unites two different epochs of history on the table. And then on top of that, of course, you see tamarind paste, and I'm going to talk a little about it, coconut milk, tomatoes, very new world, of course, and of course, garam masala. And tamarind, from the Arabic, of course, tamar hind, the Indian date, okay? And Tamarindus indica, of course, grows wild in Sudan and the sea-facing slopes of Oman. And one hypothesis is that Arab sailors found it pulped, packed, and sold in Indian bazaars and named it analogically after dates sold similarly. And tamarind is, of course, used extensively in Indian and Southeast Asian cuisine, and which, of course, is an important ingredient, all of us knew, in Worcestershire sauce, right? Where would Western cuisine be without Kerala and West Africa, right? In some ways. This, though, most of you would be aware of that. This is a completely underworked part of it. On the other hand, betel leaf is the link between, in fact, Southeast Asia and South Asia. That echoes the pathways of dispersal of coconut, areca nut, sago palm, and certain yams. Not only does this attention to the space between nations, which is my argument today, and the time before nations, with specific attention to food, allow us a deeper structure for globalization. It also allows a view of Asian modernity outside of colonialism, not just post-colonial, but extra-colonial, visible especially in the unwritten history of Pan and public orality. And I don't know, how many of you know Pan, the leaf? And so it's relatively, this is of course wrong sampling of the audience. Most people, in fact, first when one of my doctoral students who's working on Pan and public orality, people first think it's pawn, and then they think it's porn. So there's a whole series of mixing, so that has to be, so a picture is necessary to state what it is. It is as important, I think, I would argue, to the South Asian economy, politics, and culture as coffee is to Europe and America. Habermas, of course, and Benedict Anderson and Wolfgang Schivelbusch have written eloquently about the coffee house and the bourgeois public sphere, where the very idea of the public is born. The very specific sites, coffee house and cafes in the 18th and 19th centuries, where deliberative exchange of ideas about policy are debated orally among men, and men specifically, and in written form in newspapers. So this is where newspapers are, of course, born. Modern literature, art, and aesthetics are critiqued in journals, exchanged in the coffee houses, and then, of course, the tea houses that gathered the women excluded from the masculine bourgeois domain of coffee houses. Working class men, of course, seeking respite, and sometimes in response, build their own public houses that we call pubs for a reason. That in turn would provoke, of course, female temperance movements, which in themselves would be singular catalysts to women's suffrage in a number of places in the world. So notwithstanding the radical simplification that I'm forced to undertake here, think where would the Indian polity be without the pawn shop? The public of the politician, the public of Bollywood could exist no more than the Habermasian bourgeois public could be constituted without coffee and the coffee shop. What is it with stimulants and men and gossip that led to public policy? The public sphere, which is the sphere, of course, outside the control of the state and yet not domesticated. So there is work to be done on Pan and Pan's connection to Indian publics and extra-colonial transactions in trade and taste between peninsular India and Southeast Asia. There is no work on it, substantial work on it yet. Of course, there are connections even further afield than the limits of the Indian Ocean. Octavio Paz, Nobel laureate, Mexican poet, and ambassador to India, for a decade in his evocative book Vislumbres de India in Light of India, posits one hypothetical connection long before translocalism became a fashionable academic pursuit. After talking about the obvious Indian borrowing of chili and chiku sopeta and guava, in fact, when I was growing up, I thought guava was the most authentic Odia fruit because I saw it in every backyard in Orissa. I didn't know it was a New World thing until I read Octavio Paz. He notes, I quote, in Travancore and elsewhere in the south of India, they designate a certain class of curries with the name moili, which seems to be a corruption, Octavio Paz says, of our mole. Mole comes from muli, sauce. There is an undeniable similarity, he writes, between curry and mole, the combination of the sweet and the spicy, the reddish color full of sumptuous reflections, and its accompaniment to a meat or vegetable. Mole was invented in a convent in Puebla in the 17th century. Is it, he asks, is it an ingenious Mexican version of curry? Or is curry a Hindu adaptation of a Mexican sauce? He asks. Of course, he links it to the story of Catarina de San Juan, a famous 17th century Mexican visionary who came, of course, from India and is buried in Puebla in the chapel of the convent of Santa Clara, the same convent where the mole was invented. Catarina was kidnapped, perhaps at the age of 8 or 10, by pirates on the west coast of India. Then she lived for a while in Cochin as a slave, from where she was taken to Puebla in 1621. The rest is improbable history. We have, of course, now come very far from the Indian Ocean. The Stanford anthropologist Akhil Gupta points out in our recent book, which just came out, called Curried Cultures, edited book, I quote, pre-modern globalization, much of which took place before the 15th century, was not a shallow phenomenon. It did not merely influence the lives of those who lived in coastal areas along the great ocean trade routes and those who lived on the vast intercontinental land routes like the Silk Route, but affected the intimate lives of people from these places. Religion and ritual, typically regarded as intimate and community-centered, were profoundly shaped by these global movements, as were ideas and images and material artifacts in which people ate, dressed, and ate. In short, if one thinks of the extensiveness, reach, and sociological importance of these earlier moments of globalization, they may have been even more far-reaching than anything we might observe today, end quote. Such a claim, of course, immediately raises questions of metrics and methods. How is one to measure the degree of globalization? Nowhere is this question more problematic than, of course, in the realm of ideas and everyday practices. And some argue that this is kind of one source, If we weigh the extensiveness, intensity, velocity, and impact of global interconnections, then the period before European empires was characterized by thin globalization. But from the perspective of a devout Indonesian Muslim, such an assertion that the impact of global flows before European empires was low might appear rather puzzling, if not blatantly Eurocentric. It might be helpful to remember that the great diffusion of world religions took place well before the period of European empires. That is, in the era that some authors term as a period of thin globalization. So the efflorescence of historical studies of food in the last 2 decades strenuously reject a version of history that privileges the last quarter of the 20th century as a watershed in the grand narrative of globalization. In fact, if anything, such writing, for the most part, tends to reinforce a version of history that stresses the continuous flow of foods and foodways over time, food preparation and consumption as the most intimate, everyday household activity is a wonderful metric, I think, for the depth of globalization. If rice is self, as Emiko Onukitierne famously noted, then the self is clearly borrowed and has proliferated in almost every river valley and delta, from southern Japan through southern Korea, southern China, Southeast Asia to peninsular India. More than 2 billion rice eaters, and in fact language, that other great marker of civilizational zones, wraps itself around the rice-growing bottoms of floodplains and steep mountain valleys, of course, in the northeast, as you watched last night. Every major rice-growing river valley in India produces its linguistic culture, from the Ganges and Brahmaputra down Mahanadi, Krishna, Godavari to Kaveri. Of course, as you saw last night, it is not just a matter of bottoms of river valleys. Still, the children I hear, I'm told, documents the life, work, and rituals of the Garos of Meghalaya. In northeast India, where cultivating ancient strains of rice is central to the sense of self. One hypothesis is that the rice spread to India through the hills of the northeast. In the January 2012 issue of the journal Rice, that synthesized research in genetics, historical linguistics, and archaeobotany, Dorian Fuller notes that civilization should refer to historical outcomes of exchanges and borrowings between societies, end quote. Fuller then continues to argue that I would suggest the study of civilization must pay attention to both the borrowings that link large geographical and population areas and ways in which those borrowings are reshaped to be adapted to local cultural styles. A later historical example is, of course, provided by Buddhism, which spread widely through monsoon Asia, but took on very different regional expressions. And so, again, 2 central points here. This is from Dorian Fuller's work, which is one, of course, is the red boundary, which is rice, as you can see. And the second are the foci of rice cultivation in north and central China. And it is hypothesized that Oryza indica was born of a series of hybridizations along the northern route. That's her hypothesis. Oryza sativa's heavily borrowed provenance and intensely hybrid constitution does not, of course, obstruct its essential appropriation in the Bengali proverb. This is kind of the 2 routes, possible routes, the hypotheses of it, the northern route and the northeastern route of dispersion. Notwithstanding the borrowed nature of it, the Bengali insists, bhate mache Bangali, right? And it's that the Farakka barrage, about 250 kilometers north of Kolkata, has been a source of conflict between India and Bangladesh, partly because of the issue of water sharing, but equally, I think, based on the assertion that West Bengalis appropriate more than their fair share of Ilish Mach. Conventionally identified with East Bengalis, the fish travels upstream from the Bay of Bengal, laying eggs in Indian waters, but by the time they are grown and ready to be eaten, they are trapped behind the barrage, depriving Bangladeshis of their fair share of fatty fish. I would be very hostile if somebody took away Hilsa from me, right? In case of rice and fish, agroecological, linguistic, and culinary maps, in fact, exceed national domains and are worth attending to in terms of the emotional, spiritual, and administrative energy we pour into state containers. In transactions of taste, The Cambridge anthropologist Manpreet Janeja connects the Muslim prayer, call for prayer, azan, to the cymbals and bells, perfumed flowers, and incense offerings of the Hindu Shondhar Aruti Pujo, yoked together by the secular aromas of sizzling begunis, fried eggplants in gram batter, shingaras, which are Bengali samosas, puchka, jhalmuri, chow mein, Bengali Chinese iteration. So food insinuates itself, sometimes between hostile communities. Assertions of innate differences, of course, are always fragile, contentious claims, laced with acrimony, especially against those who might pass and cross over. In covering both Hindu and Muslim practices in Kolkata and Dhaka, this book, Transactions in Taste, is path-breaking. It just came out. In accounting for practices and constructions of taste across a border crossed by millions, legally and illegally, but invisible to the tools of the cultural sciences. Surprising analogies between Kolkata and Dhaka open windows into the stifled science of space between nations. Janeja's project rattles national and religious cages in the name of language and food. So my last example. After more than 20 years of fieldwork, Caroline Osella and Filippo Osella noticed that Keralites build their gustatory identities, sometimes facing inland towards the heartland, and sometimes facing outward towards the Arabian Sea. They concluded that, I quote, differences in dietary practice between communities in Kerala are glaring and are, we argue, indicative of increasing communalization of all aspects of social life, end quote. Unfortunately, I think, in reducing Keralite everyday practices to the discourses of Hindu and Muslim identity, they elide over the subtle and silent residue of an orientation to the sea that no amount of nationalist territorialization nor religious polarization will let Keralites forget. The obvious is unavoidable, that everyone in Kerala is within easy reach of the coast and that fresh fish is delivered daily throughout the state and is a core item in most diets, that freshly grated coconut, green chilies, and curry leaf are ubiquitous and considered quintessentially Keralite. Of course, not everyone chooses to think of themselves in this coastal state as living near the sea, especially in dominant discourses of difference and ideologies of nation and religion. But in habits and in everyday practice, the land and the sea pulls them together, sometimes in spite of themselves. The point, I think, is to excavate the evidence submerged in middens, trading vessels, trading posts, cooking pots, and fishing nets. The communal and national rewriting of one's identity has been successful only through the last century's folly of imagining cultural homes with hearts, as in Heartland, and the unrelenting mass-mediated propaganda that has left us all pointing towards the Indo-Gangetic Valley's centrality to Indian civilization. That is a small part of the story. That does not explain the Northeast. It cannot explain Meghalaya. That cannot explain Gujarat, of Barukacha of the Gulf of Cambay, of Kanagiri along the Maharashtra coast, of Kochi in Kerala, Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, or West Bengal, which according to the 2011 census is the story of at least 650 million Indians. So what I'm saying is, let us get a sense of proportion here between the stories we tell and their fit with the everyday habits of the people on whose behalf we tell these stories. The time has come, I think, to engage, to inhabit the edges of the continents, the skin, so to speak, against the heartland, and as the precise point of contact and flows of people, of culture, of cuisine, where the New World chili meets the literal coconut and the curry leaf to materialize a culture not merely as metaphor, but as, in fact, as real curry, hot, spicy, and aromatic. So in conclusion, the basic tools of cultural history and demographics have been so nationalized that they have repressed the centrality of connections between neighboring regions, say, of course, we know, in Punjab and Bengal. Similarly, we ignored the evidence of material cultural exchanges between the port cities of the Indian Ocean littoral. Such a construction does not even get the nation right. Okay? A new history of oceans and a renewed visibility of transnational circulation are reinvigorating discussions of cultural domains that exceed the nation state. The inaudible world of taste and trade in comestibles opens a window into the stifled science of the space between nations. That is what I have tried to recover today with a few examples, a few instances of cuisines between nations to shift our focus from the tired curries of the heartland. To do that, we have to sometimes go beyond and around the nation state. Instead of heartlands and national wholes, we have a more productive mapping of taste and place in the Hindustani saying, "Kose kose par pani badle, chare kose parwani." Okay, that in every 2 miles the water changes, where water is a metonym for taste, and every 4 the language. It nicely puts the narrating subject in the middle of both the discussion and the landscape that extends endlessly and incrementally in all directions, which of course shows, in fact, a much better grasp of reality than the edges, borders, and boundaries that appear in the 4-colored maps of modernity that have come to colonize our minds. Thank you. Get out of here, yep.
Hi, I'm Donna Bakke. I'm the Chair of Public Health and Preventive Medicine and the Director of the Master of Public Health Program at Upstate Medical University. I'm a pediatrician and a nutritionist. And so I'm going to respond to this in a little bit of a different way. I really want to thank Dr. Ray for his wonderful overview of the globalization, early globalization, how that helped to really develop the fragrant, spicy food that we know as Asian Indian food. But I also want to bring to mind modern globalization, which has really allowed that food to really go worldwide through the immigration of Asian Indians into the United States and other parts of the world, through the internet, which has allowed people easy access to information, and I would even say through the Food Network, which most recently, and I watch it occasionally, it's one of its new Food Network stars, was an Indian American who now has her own show, and really is highlighting Asian Indian food. But I also think that we have to think of what some of the other things that the larger modern globalization has done to, I believe, the health of children in India. And really look at what's happened because of the rapid growth in India's economy and also other Asian economies, which were very much underdeveloped, and now through this modern globalization has allowed worldwide companies into India and brought more people into the cities from the rural areas. And so what we now see, and there's a recent report, UNICEF State of the World Children's report, that demonstrates us that we're seeing more and more undernutrition in cities in India. People moving into the rural areas who once would have cooked some of this wonderful cuisine, who now maybe can't afford it because they're moving into the cities and not finding jobs, and so having to feed their children maybe just rice or just rice milk and not the other vegetables and meats that would have balanced their diet. So there's a growing need of undernutrition in those cities, and we now have 3 of the 21 largest megacities in India. So we can see that there's really, this modernization really has done a disservice, I think, to some of the children who are really going to be the next generation of people in India. But it also has done a disservice in another way, because as the economy has grown and you have more middle class and more upper class people, we in America have unfortunately also not only exported a lot of our factories there, but some of our standard American diet. So I wanted to, let me see if I can do this. If you can look, by this is really kind of demonstrates that, as McDonald's is now everywhere there. So what you see is now a dichotomy in the health of children in India. You have this large group of children who are undernourished and growing group of undernourished children, but you also have a growing group of children who are overnourished in a way that is going to cause potential health problems that were never recognized in India before, because they're eating now the same standard American diet, high fat, not very flavorful, lack of vegetables, mostly refined grains, refined carbohydrates, not really healthy pre-modern, I would say, rices or heritage rices that are grown in some of the parts of India that are really cherished by even some people, high-end people in the United States as gourmet rices. But they're now eating foods that really lack nutrition and are getting heavier. There was a recent study, and I just want to include by this. In 2008, they did a study, and you can see the dichotomy by the obesity levels in adolescents. In private schools in cities in India, now 29% of the adolescents are considered overweight or obese, where in public schools, so the people who can't afford to send their children, it's only 11%. So you can see that this wonderful cuisine that we know as Asian Indian food that a lot of us have come to recognize here in the United States is being threatened by some of what modern globalization has now brought to that country. And I think we need to really think, and people who study this need to think this through, because what we see now as an epidemic in this country will become an epidemic in India as their economy grows and people become more wealthy. And I'd really like to see the people who study this and to really see how we can prevent that, because I'd hate to see another country having to go through what we're going through right now with the children we see.
Good morning. Could I have my slides? Okay, well, presentation, and I'll try to respond to only a very small part of it. I'm not a culinary expert at all. I'm a food scientist / nutritionist from the Department of Food Science at Cornell. I often tell my students who are food scientists or budding food scientists that the greatest challenges that they are facing as they proceed to their professional careers are food, water, and climate change. And all of these, I think, are very important challenges as we try to figure out how we're going to feed the 9 billion people that are going to populate our planet by the middle of this century. And it's a huge challenge, but one I think that we have to meet, and I think we are capable of meeting. Dr. Baki mentioned some of the problems around the world in undernutrition or malnutrition. My specialty is in the area of iron nutrition and iron deficiency, and it's estimated that worldwide we currently have about 1.6 billion people who suffer from iron deficiency. This is a huge number. And the distribution of these deficiencies is not uniform across the world. This is a graphic from the WHO that shows the prevalence of anemia in preschool children in various countries around the world. And the dark red represents severe anemia. Greater than 40% of children under the age of 5 in these countries suffer from anemia. And so that's a huge problem that we have to address. And India is one of the countries where the prevalence of anemia in children is the highest. It's estimated that prevalence of iron deficiency, I should say, is the highest. It's estimated that perhaps 70% of children in India are iron deficient. And also stunting is a major problem. Stunting is low height for age. This is a serious problem in many countries around the world. And again, we see in India, the prevalence of stunting in children under 5 is very high. So there are serious nutritional problems in this area of the world. But as a food scientist, I wanted to sort of focus in a little bit on rice, which was mentioned by Dr. Ray. When we can't eat what is called rough rice, the rice that is harvested, because it contains a hull or a husk that's really very inedible, and that has to be removed before we can eat it. Below that husk is a layer called bran, which we can eat, and many of us do, but some of us don't. And then the interior of the rice kernel is called the endosperm, and this is primarily starch with a low concentration of protein, but it's low in micronutrients. And to process this, there are different ways of processing rice. One of them is to simply remove the husk, and then we eat what we call brown rice. And this is becoming more popular now. I'm sure many of you enjoy brown rice, as I do. It has the bran intact. It's not been removed. And another kind of rice is what is called well-milled sticky rice. And this is in this rice, the rice is milled to basically remove that bran layer. So all you have left is the starchy endosperm. Perspective as to how this developed. Why do different regions of the rice-eating world process their rice differently? It's believed that parboiled rice originated in ancient India. Exactly why it developed is not known, but the Mediterranean connection was mentioned earlier, and some people have speculated that the Indians parboiled their rice because they learned about it from the Mediterranean region where wheat was parboiled. And that technology came to India, and then India adopted it. And to parboiled rice, what you need to do is you need to soak, the rice is soaked before it is milled, soaked in water, and then it is perhaps heated, or currently in modern day practice, it's called converted rice, and basically it's steamed, and then it's dried, and then it's milled. And what you end up with is a rice kernel that is firmer and less sticky. And just to go back here, you can see that it has a slightly yellowish color, and that's because of a certain amount of browning that occurs, but it's less sticky, and whereas the well-milled sticky rice, which is milled before it's heated or cooked or parboiled, is very sticky. And this has a... Oh, something stopped. Okay, I can't see. Oh, there we go.
There it goes. Oh,
Good. Okay.
I'm pulling batteries in for you. Keyboard go.
Okay. There we go. Okay, there we go. Okay. So, and basically, this shows, this is from a publication by Bhattacharya, which shows that in India, where parboiled rice is very common, you'll see it's very in South India and in sort of the northeast of India. And this shows basically how the technology of rice changes in Japan, in eastern China, in Indonesia. The preference is for the sticky rice, non-parboiled, whereas in India, the preference is for the parboiled rice. And this has nutritional implications, and there was a publication in The Lancet dating back to 1909, which said, in which Dr. Brandon, who was a British physician, said, always and everywhere the uncured rice-eating community, namely the Chinese, by uncured rice means non-parboiled rice, suffered from beriberi, while eaters of cured rice, the Tamils in India, with equal invariability escaped beriberi. And beriberi, of course, is thiamine deficiency. And thiamine deficiency was a huge problem in China, in Southeast Asia 100 years ago, but it was not a problem in India, even though both of these communities consumed rice. And presumably, the speculation is that the reason this occurred is that when you parboil most of the micronutrients in rice are in the bran layer. And of course, when you mill the rice and remove that bran layer, you're removing a lot of the vitamins and the minerals. When you parboil the rice before you mill it, presumably it drives some of these water-soluble nutrients from the bran layer into the endosperm. So then when you mill the rice, you're not losing so much of them. And this just shows, for example, in brown rice, the concentration of thiamine is 3.4 milligrams per kilogram, whereas in white rice that has been milled before parboiling, it's 0.5, and in parboiled rice, it's 2.5. So it is somewhat lower in parboiled rice than it is in brown rice, but not all that much lower. So this is presumably one of the reasons why the Indians didn't suffer from beriberi the way the Chinese and the Southeast Asians did. And more recently, there's been a few studies that have suggested that parboiled rice actually has another nutritional benefit. And it was mentioned about obesity and diabetes as being a problem now in India. But one of the speculations is that when you parboil rice, you partially gelatinize the starch. And then when it's cooled, that starch crystallizes and it becomes less digestible. And it's not digestible as quickly, and therefore it has a lower glycemic index. Glycemic index basically is a measure of how rapidly a food increases blood sugar concentrations after consumption. And white bread, for example, is just about like eating sugar because it really causes a very rapid rise in blood sugar concentrations. Rice is less glycemic than white flour, white wheat flour, but if it has been parboiled first, then it slows the rate of digestion of the carbohydrates, of the starch, and you have less of a glycemic response. So this is an example of how food technology and food processing evolved over centuries to actually have nutritional impacts, presumably beneficial. Now, I doubt that the Indians were thinking about thiamine deficiency or glycemic index when they developed the technology to parboil their rice. But anyway, that's what they did, and that's what's happened. I've been trying to figure out how much Indians continue to consume parboiled rice, and a couple of people have suggested that it's still quite popular in many areas of India. I think in the US it's actually fairly popular. Uncle Ben's converted rice is really parboiled rice. So a lot of people in the US also enjoy parboiled rice. But if you go to a Chinese restaurant, you will probably get the well-milled, non-parboiled sticky rice, which is easier to eat with your chopsticks. With that, I will turn the floor over to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ray, Dr. Bakshi, and Dr. Miller. The floor is now open for questions. Dr. Ray, anybody questions for Dr. Ray?
Actually, yes. Dr. Ray, I'd like to hear your comments about what Dr. Baki was talking about in terms of what seems like a rapid transition in diet in India, vis-a-vis the types of things that you spoke of and the health effects of them.
You going to start a fight? Yes. Here, this is good. This is good. This is good, right? This is good. Yeah. I'm less certain. It's worrying what's happening in India up to a point, and of course you can see the evidence in it in terms of the epidemiological evidence. But I think there's also a substantial cultural resource. I'm hoping general Indian close-mindedness about food might be productive here. There are no people in the world who are less omnivorous than Indians. And maybe it's changing, and that's kind of, in a sense, where open-mindedness is a terrible thing, I think, sometimes. But I'm hoping some of the close-mindedness and all the very stringent rules, including rules of vegetarianism between different groups, though I argued today in some ways not to reduce that to all Indians, is going to be, in some ways, create an interesting kind of a dynamic where there would be local resources of resistance, where part of it, I think, the basic flavoring agents of the industrial cuisines are basically animal fats and sugars and salt. And the fact that there are these numerous alternative sources which makes food so very interesting in many parts of the world, including Southeast Asia, South Asia, would provide some degree of resources to resist this mass industrialization and processing of food with which you have the consequences. Those are kind of worrying, legitimate consequences. So give it a little more time, I think. It's going to be wrestled down to a stalemate, my sense is. But I'm kind of an incurable optimist about these things, I don't know.
About rice, in Bangladesh where all the rice is parboiled, when I ask people about it, they always said the reason we do it is to kill any bugs in it before that we can store it a long time. So maybe that was the rationale, this spread. But my question is, what's the difference between red rice and brown rice? Because I always eat red rice. And is that just a different variety or a little different?
Yeah, it's a different variety. I'm not that familiar with it, but it's a different variety, and it has more polyphenolic compounds in it, which basically are often considered to be bioactive and have health benefits in terms of their antioxidant characteristics. But it's basically a different variety. So, of course, there are many, many different varieties of rice. And basmati rice is very popular in India. And indica rice, and so there are, I don't know, probably hundreds of different varieties. But the way they're processed basically is, as I mentioned, to remove the hull or the husk, and then either leave, and I think in order for it to, and then leave the bran layer intact or remove it. And this is an example of perhaps of how we talk about overly processed foods as being not so healthy for you, and that's one of the issues I think with rice is that we've gotten to the point of processing it too much, and again that is related to the storing capacity because the germ of rice contains oils, which contain unsaturated fatty acids. And these unsaturated fatty acids can be oxidized, and when they're oxidized, they create off flavors and off odors. And so one of the reasons for milling rice is to remove those oils so that it keeps longer.
Dr. Ray, is there much of a slow food movement amongst the middle and upper middle class in India?
I mean, not as ideologically visible yet, but I think slow food movement becomes more visible where the fast food movement has already won. So because in India, the fast food movement hasn't won. It is one of the dynamics. And I think what people don't know is that they don't realize is that they're eating slow food. And I think a lot of it is going to change. And I think that's my big theory. That there's going to be no Indian culture left after we have the servant problem. That's coming over the next 20 years with the economic growth. That would be the bigger challenge because a lot of the labor-intensive work at home is done by servants. And that is the thing to watch, as happened in the US at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. How Indian middle classes are going to respond to the servant crisis. And so in a sense, there's none of that self-consciousness about slow because I think self-consciousness of slow comes with the victory of fast. And in India, in that sense, that's why I'm also hopeful that the fast hasn't won out. But the fast hasn't partly won out because of the availability of a servant class.
Well, in response to that, when I visited India, I was visiting institutes and places where they were packaging slow food and packages for fast people.
Yes.
And so I was wondering if the nutrition levels of those are just as good as the slow food. Is there another comment on that?
I guess it would depend on whether it was freshly, if it was freshly cooked and packaged, so that, it was bought in the market, cooked there soon after, and packaged to be eaten immediately, I would say probably the nutritional value is the same. But if they're doing anything to preserve it, you know, in terms of pre-packaging it and allowing the people, then it probably differs. Because that's where, you know, that's where the problem is here, as you talk about, you know, with a lot of, you have to process food in order to give it a longer shelf life. So if you're taking this slow food and making it, you know, in a factory somewhere and then bringing it to the little deli, you know, in the institute for people to eat, there's probably something that has been put in to give it a longer shelf life, which may affect it. But if it's actually being done right there, so freshly made, freshly brought in from the markets, and then just packaged there so that you can take it and go, as opposed to sitting and waiting for it to be made fresh, it probably won't affect it that much. At least that's what I would think.
I could respond to that a little bit. I have a colleague who travels to India quite frequently, Professor Sai Rizvi. He's a native Indian, and he's always telling me one of the big problems in India is with preserving foods, because during the harvest season, there's an abundance of fruits and vegetables. A lot of it goes to waste because they don't have any way of preserving it or extending the shelf life. And so it's kind of like, you know, there are periods of time when there are a lot of really fresh, very good, highly nutritious foods available, but then after the season is over, then they don't have access to a variety of foods. And so what he's always suggesting is we've got to figure out ways to appropriately preserve and process foods in countries like India so that they can have a more consistent access to nutritious foods. And as a food scientist, many of us maybe are somewhat defensive, but we say that, you know, what's this big deal about fresh? You know, we're saying, you know, in this part of the country, 75 years ago, we didn't have fresh fruits and vegetables in April. We had canned, we had frozen. Bird's Eye actually started over here in Western New York, frozen fruits and frozen vegetables. And that made many more vegetables available year-round to people living in upstate New York. And it's only fairly recently that we have been transporting our food from California, South America, Florida, so that we can have, quote, fresh. And that has some issues, I think, in terms of food miles, because we have to transport our food such long distances. And also, when you transport vegetables, for example, in the fresh form, nutritional value does decline. And if it spends a week getting here, the nutritional value of, say, a frozen variety that's processed immediately after harvest may actually be higher than the fresh. And so a lot of us are concerned is that with this big emphasis now that we hear about, oh, it has to be fresh to be nutritious, is actually, it probably is harmful, particularly for low-income people, because the fresh tends to be more expensive, whereas a package, say, of frozen green beans is $1, and you can serve 5 people with that, or 20 cents a serving. If you buy the fresh green beans that are imported from California or some other place, it's going to be considerably more expensive. So I would advocate that if we really want to improve the overall nutritional status in countries like India, we need to figure out ways for preserving some of these fruits and vegetables so that they're available for longer periods of time.
I would agree with that. I think, you know, preserving in healthy ways.
Yes,
and
absolutely,
not adding,
absolutely.
And food additives.
And one of the problems we have now, I mean, a lot of the large food companies like Kraft and PepsiCo, they see India and China as emerging huge markets, and they're moving into these countries in a big way with some of their products that do have a fair amount of added salt and sugar and fat, and are probably not so healthy. But they seem to be very popular.
I was thinking about food in regards to status, which I think about with rice so often, because I remember conversations I've had with people
I think that, I've heard the same thing about white bread, 100 years ago. It was very expensive, and only the wealthier people were able to afford it. And so it became, as you suggest, somewhat of a status.
Yes. Susan?
I wanted to ask, sorry, I wanted to ask about corn, which nobody's talked about here, because I work in a part of UP where corn is the primary diet for 6 months of the year, because that's an import from the Americas. And I've treated, because I'm an anthropologist, I've been in villages, I end up getting people coming to my door with strange things. I've treated the labor there, so can we have a little discussion of what happened with corn from Mexico to India and why Indians are suspect to nutrition deficiencies in corn?
I know nothing about it.
Maybe I can try and answer
Yeah.
that. I think in Mexico, I mean, when Mexicans, the South Americans use corn, they usually treat it with lime. So that releases out the tryptophan, which gets converted into niacin, which is a B vitamin. In India, it's corn flour, and there is no treatment to it. I mean, there's no lemon or anything added to it. It's usually treated like you would make chapati flour, chapati dough, which would be just whole wheat along with a little salt or perhaps some oil. So I think that was, if you go back to the history of pellagra, that is how pellagra was discovered, because there was a difference between corn-eating populations in Mexico versus in Spain. And in Spain, they did not, in the European countries, they did not treat corn with lemon. And so there was no release of tryptophan, and so that is the reason. Yes, yes. It's a way of how it's prepared, what ingredients are used, and what goes along with it. Now, I mean, if you look at the Indian diet, it's perhaps the niacin deficiency might not be such a big deal because usually the breads are eaten with some kind of lentils or dal, so you have that complementary protein. So it could possibly occur in very low-income populations where there is a problem getting the dals itself, or it might just be that there's dal in the house, but there is a certain hierarchy of its usage. So you have certain people given the dal versus other people not getting the dal. So there are all those inequalities that tend to occur also. So that might be one possibility. Yes, Anand, and then yes. Yes.
My concern was one is the land is part where it's supposed to be broadcasting, and I think in look at the related domain also, when we offer rice, it's very part of the rituals of worshiping God. Rice is part of that, and hardly any part where rice we won't give it because otherwise
I think cooking should be encouraged. And most people, I agree with Anand. We were talking about slow food movement. I mean, in India, slow food movement has been there for generations. So people typically eat seasonally. What we talk about here as eating seasonal foods, they have been doing that for generations. And people know what grows best in the season. Then they take those vegetables or fruits, they convert them into pickles, which are not necessarily nutritionally sound, but tried into dried products, which could be reused at a time when those are not available. But I think in the modern time, it is almost, people don't want to get involved in those kinds of labor-intensive processes. So, grandmothers did it, and now the modern-day grandmothers perhaps know or don't know too much about some of those techniques. So somehow a revival of some of these techniques has to be done. And one of the Millennium Goal objectives was to reintroduce cooking, and they've done that very well in Korea, for instance. They've got this television program in the morning where they teach young women how to make some of the traditional dishes. So perhaps movements like that have to happen in the Indian context. And then if it happens over there, it'll happen over here too, because that's another issue with the immigrant women. So. Yeah.
Maybe if you're having a servant problem, we should introduce cooking classes in middle and high school.
They do. I mean, cooking was part of the family. You didn't have to go to cooking classes, but girls would cook. They would, now they don't. Some do, some don't. So. Yes.
This is a question for Dr. Ray. The last slide of your presentation showed that the sea coastal areas of India are basically fish-eating places except for Gujarat. Could you please tell us a little more about Gujarat, why culture triumphs over ecology there?
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fascinating. Which tells you, of course, in some ways, in much of the cultural sciences, we have fled from geographical determinism for a long time. And I think we are now coming back in some complicated ways because of its history, its association with kind of a racialized understanding of the world. But in fact, Gujarat is a terrific example where it complicates. So in a sense, if you look at that map, most of coastal India, especially eastern coast, is about 6 to 7% vegetarianism. Which is, again, the point of that for me was to, again, not to reduce India, which Indians do, by the way, and non-Indians do, India equal to vegetarianism, okay? That's 20% of the story, 30% of the story. So that was the larger point. But if you look at that on the east coast, it's about 6, 7%. If you go up the west coast, you have Karnataka, about 34%, and then Maharashtra and Gujarat is the highest. And part of it, of course, has to do with the heterodox movements, out of which historians argue was Hinduism's response to Buddhism and Jainism. That's the heart of some of the strongest, Jain being a good example of it, which seriously challenges meat eating and also fish eating. So Gujarat ends up with about 70% of the population vegetarian. Gujarat also has some of the oldest Muslim populations in India. And in fact, Islam, which is in some ways sometimes get lost in this understanding of what Gujarat has become, at least in the last 20, 30 years. Indonesia gets its Islam from Gujarat. It's a Gujarati Islam that goes through that trade network. And of course, then if you go up Gujarat, and then if you go to Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, etc., about 30, 40%, And then, of course, if you go up to Kashmir again, because the demographics, you go down to 15%. So it's a question of heartland. Okay? And the idea of, in some ways, the orthodox and the heterodox traditions, I think, that emerge, that's at least one of the arguments about how that happens, where in a sense, culture, so to put it simplistically, triumphs geography. Of course, these are not two separate things. And then east coast of peninsular India is the farthest from the ideological reach of this. Brahmins in Bengal eat fish, which scandalizes Brahmins in other places. And also it's astonishing with me when I talk to students, to my Indian students, there's also this essentializing. Of course we are Indians and so we are vegetarians. I said, really? I'm Indian too. I'm like Never had a vegetarian meal, almost. Exaggerating. So in a sense, one has to construct this kind of complex idea, of course. India, of course, in a sense, is continental. It's like saying what Europeans do. It's like, so are Europeans Poles or are Europeans Sicilians? So that's what it is.
Yes.
Yes, I just want to, what Joanne said just brought to my attention, and I totally agree with Joanne said, some mindset of the people who change, with food consumption. From my observation, I come from China, I can see how people change their diet because of those cultural change. For example, like the fast food, McDonald's, KFC. We all know that's not fast food, but people just part out there because it's fancy. And I also noticed in some wealthy people, they start to eat those unbleached, food made with unbleached flour, which was eaten by poor people a long time ago, like 50 years ago. But now they start to realize, okay, this probably something more healthy, and some of them will eat some carefully selected wild plants and like those. So have you noticed that kind of cultural impact on this food consumption?
Yeah, I mean, of course, yeah, status and especially industrial food. But I think the beautiful thing about it that we in the U.S. are making industrial fast food so uncool that is also going to spread, and that is already spreading. Which is, I think that you'll get over that. In fact, I would say, if you add all the McDonald's and the KFCs, etc., it doesn't add up to that much for about 1.2 billion people. Where in fact you might have a more health intervention is to take away the very traditional sweet shop. Okay, so in a sense, I'm not sure it is the McDonald's and the KFC that is having that kind of a direct impact. It has an ideological impact, but I think that's also being circumvented quite nicely by the current criticism here. All the cool people, it seems, here have stopped eating there. So all the other cool people in the world are catching up with these cool people. So this kind of circulation of these ideas also flow and come in interesting ways, I think. So it is a issue. And I can say this because I'm not a public health professional. I can say it because I'm not a physician. But it is worth saying it in a sense is KFC, McDonald's, etc. In fact, quite different from Coca-Cola. I think that is a much greater impact.
Right.
And which is, of course, a lot of the thing about KFC and McDonald's is you get the Coca-Cola in it. McDonald's, KFC itself, I think, are irrelevant to the diets of most people in these parts of it, other than through liquid sugars. That is the big transformation. And that is tasty and addictive. I know it's terrible. I still love to drink it once in a while. And that it's the most artificial and the most beautiful of flavors. How many black foods do you get in the world? And liquid kind of sugar. So that is a threat. That is a problem. The liquid sugars are a problem. And I don't know. People are better in addressing those
I agree with
questions.
that, but I also think that where you see, I think it's the growing middle class rather than the upper class, which is the upper class probably can afford, like the upper class here, to eat healthier, and may recognize that and probably are more knowledgeable of the fact that a lot of those foods are unhealthy. I think where you're probably seeing the biggest growth is the people who are now kind of that growing lower middle class where they're going out of poverty and now they can afford things and they see, well, this is something new and different. Let's try it. This is a treat. They start going, like we used to do, start going out as a treat, and then it becomes a habit because now I have to rush off. I don't have a servant, so now I have to rush off to, pick up my kids up from school and do something else, and I need dinner, and so now McDonald's looks better. So I think, to me, the growing concern is with that rising lower middle to middle class, and I agree with you 100% that it's the sugar is and the addiction to the sugar and is a big problem.
Time for a couple more questions.
I wanted to take a moment for shameless self-promotion. Back to the topic of food preservation and indigenous or home-scale food preservation. I want to invite you guys all to Cornell on Sunday and Monday, speaker, Sandra Katz, who's author of The Art of Fermentation, or soon-to-be-released poem, Art of Fermentation, another book, Wild Fermentation. He's got a book called The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved.
Yes. Yeah.
He's going to be coming to campus to give a couple presentations and talks within the community and the Cornell campus. So if you guys are in Ithaca, I can send you information. We'd love to have you all there.
Lovely.
Thanks. Tim?
Yeah, I would just have to add my voice to the group of public health people. That we have to challenge this idea of what's going on. And I think it's important to keep in mind when we're talking about South Asia, urban South Asia is so different from rural South Asia. And the ideals are sort of in the rural area. I can't help but think, in the years I've been doing work in India and more recently in Tibet, there is a massive transition in attitude, particularly in young people, but college age and 20s type people who are eating faster foods, unhealthy foods, lots of soda and all of that sort of stuff. And in India, you see just in the past 15, 20 years, this huge transition, at least in the cities. I really don't know what it's doing in the rural areas, but where I've been working in cities, there's something going on that's leading to these stats that you quoted in terms of doubling of obesity rates, and we know in adults, cancers, heart diseases, and all these other things. So I don't know if you've dug into that enough yet. Maybe in the rest of the conference, since we are focusing on health and nutrition and food and agriculture, maybe we'll.
I want to add a caveat. I just look like an Indian. I'm not an Indian expert.
I think, there's a debate going on now. Well, the obesity epidemic, is it just intake or is it also energy expenditure?
Yes.
And we don't have very good evidence on energy expenditure. A lot of people think that, in the U.S., in the last 30, 40 years, where we've seen this big rise in obesity, we really haven't changed our energy expenditure significantly. I find that kind of hard to believe, but I was in China recently. You don't see people riding bicycles anymore. They have these little electric cycles, or they're driving cars. And this is happening all around the world. People are not they're not being physically as active as they once were, and I can't help but think that that's got to be a part of the equation. And especially in urban areas, usually people are less physically active, perhaps, than in rural areas. So I think that's something we have to also take into account. But and back to the preservation of foods and eating seasonally. I certainly support eating seasonally. I think that's a great way to do it. But on the other hand, and of course in India, where the climate obviously is very different than here, you have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. Not the same ones, perhaps, but you have to. You can choose seasonal vegetables. I think that's great as long as it can be done. But I also understand that there's still a lot of food waste. I mean, that's one of the issues. If maybe worldwide we're probably wasting 30% of the harvest to some form of waste, whether it's bacterial contamination, spoilage, other cannot get it to market. And I think that's an issue that we really need to work on.
Any? Yes.
Since, as mentioned, I would also like to say something about the public health people who are more concerned about that. You all have made wonderful comments and very good information you have shared with us. But I would like to also ask and say that whatever with the globalization, these cuisines are transferring or traveling over different countries, different nations. But we are ignoring the fact all those bases or the fundamentals of those things are different combinations. Certain spices, all spices are not worth using everywhere for every person. Like if you're talking about obesity with all these nutrients, using too much citric fruit, tamarind sauces, like not ketchup, the other Worcester sauce and hot sauce and all that. These can create many more other kinds of diseases which we are not anticipating. We are focusing on obesity at the moment. And again, again, like certain lentils, rice, certain lentils and certain grains do not go together. Certain things do not work well in different climates, different countries. So we should not overlook that part, and there's a lot of research being done throughout the world, and you may be well aware of those things. It's worth considering, not for commercial point of view, for business point of view. For business, anything can be done. But when we are talking about health, especially of the children, who will be the future of all the countries or all the worlds, we have to consider that in mind. What is getting implanted in different cultures from different parts of the world? That will be a very challenging issue for all of us.
That's, of course, is Ayurveda's big insight, right? That in some ways, food, body, locale, in some ways is...
I'd like to thank Dr. Ray for a wonderful presentation this morning to open this conference, and Dr. Bakshi and Dr. Miller. As you go through the day, you will be hearing some of these issues later in the afternoon, and we'll have a break now. Thank you.
Thank you.